Welcome to today's Skill Up. My name is Emily Springer. I'm a learning specialist for National University and thrilled to be able to partner with some of our colleagues who come from the library, NU Library, to really skill us up here for lifting the lid on scholarly publishing. Couple of housekeeping items. We are recording today's session, and we absolutely would love for you to have conversation in the chat. We welcome questions. You can do that in the Q&A, or you can do that in the chat. We'll get to that as time permits. I'm very excited to have Tammy and Dan come and join today's session. So everyone go ahead and sit back and relax, and I will turn this on over to Dan to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Emily. My name is Dan, and this is my colleague, Tammy. We are both librarians here at National University, but more importantly, why are you here? Just like Emily, many of you are prospective scholars, or you already are scholars. Maybe you are hammering away at a dissertation. Maybe you just had one published. Maybe there is a long and bright future of you publishing and adding to our overall knowledge and our collective estimation of the world. So I hope that this will get you informed and have an ear to the ground on trends and things to be aware of in scholarly publishing. And the one refrain that will keep coming up, because we are going to unload so much information and data on you, is please remember, librarians are here to assist with scholarly communications, with questions about publishing. So if you forget some detail and you want to keep that in mind, I hope that you'll continue to reach out to us on chat or via email or phone here at the National University Library, because our librarians, including Tammy and myself, would love to help you out. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tammy.
Again, howdy. I repeat all the greetings to you. So here is today's agenda. We're going to talk first and foremost about picking a scholarly journal to publish in, because that really is the bread and butter of scholarly publication in a traditional sense. We're going to give some suggestions about submitting your manuscript and working with the editor through your submission and revision process, as well as a little bit of advice about post-publication tracking and how to measure the impact of your work. Then we want to spare a few words about publishing your dissertation in particular, because there are some particular nuances to keep in mind around that. And finally, leaving time for wrap-up and for questions. So I'm going to dive right into it with picking a journal. For this, we're going to really ask you to consider three measures when picking a journal to publish in: the rigor of the journal, the fit of the journal to your topic, and the prestige of the journal. Starting with journal rigor. So scholarly journal articles scholarly journals, I should say, that publish the articles, the journals vary in their rigor. All scholarly journals are well-respected publications. They publish articles written by experts in a particular field. They advance the ongoing body of work, and they really try to present original research or key questions in the field. But within that general mission of all scholarly publications, different journals may have different levels of rigor and intensity for how original of content they want to present, how rigorous and elaborate they want your research methodologies to be, how impactful your new positions or propositions are. One measure of a journal's rigor is their acceptance rate. And this is a simple mathematical formula. Don't freak out at the word math. I do. My heart rate goes up. But a journal's acceptance rate is merely the number of total manuscripts that are submitted on an annual basis, and then how many they actually accept. So if they receive 100 manuscripts a month and accept 20 of them for publication, the journal's acceptance rate would be 20%. So we are going to talk a little bit later in this presentation about where to find this information about a journal. Generally, the lower an acceptance rate, the more prestigious a journal tends to be, or the more competitive, at least, to get published in it. Another consideration when you're looking at the rigor of a journal is whether it has editorial review or peer review. So Peer review is a subset of scholarly articles. All peer-reviewed journals are scholarly, but not all scholarly publications undergo peer review. The peer review process is a step by which, when you submit a manuscript to the journal, not only does the editor of the journal review it, but they also send it out to other peers in the field to review your manuscript. I emphasize peer because they only reach out to experts in your field. As a librarian, I've been asked to peer review many library science manuscripts about instruction, reference work, etc. I would not get invited to peer review a herpetology article because I don't know nothing about frogs. So when you hear the phrase peer reviewed, it literally means what it says. Peers of the author, other experts in the field, have reviewed, sometimes called refereed, the work and provided feedback to that manuscript on whether or not it should be accepted, rejected, or revised. Note, revisions are very, very common in this process. It's important to note that there is a level of anonymity around the peer review process. It is usually at least blind, where reviewers don't know the author's name, but reviewers know the author's name, but the author does not know who the reviewers are, because the reviewers are volunteering their time. I think it's best, personally, when it's a double-blind peer review, when neither the author nor the reviewers know who each other is. I would be remiss if I didn't make a comment here that peer review is a little bit controversial. It is a traditional gold standard in the publishing and scholarly communication world that peer-reviewed manuscripts are the creme de la creme of professional scholarly research. But again, it's under review, it's being criticized, in part because of the burden on academia, because peer review is a volunteer responsibility. It's outside the scope of this webinar, so I'm not going to go in depth, but talk to your local librarian sometime, one of us. We would love to discuss the pros and cons of traditional peer review. So those are two measures of trying to identify a very rigorous journal with a low acceptance rate, a low percentage of acceptance, which means many people want to publish and only a few get selected, and journals that go through a peer review process. There's the other end of the spectrum, journals with very low rigor. And the most worrisome of all is what we call predatory journals. And here is a infographic of a little bit of information about it. I'm aware that it's a bit blurry, so I'm putting the link in chat if you want to check out the details. Predatory journals are journals that exist entirely to make money. They charge authors a fee to publish. And most importantly, they charge that fee, and that fee is all that is required to publish the work. The work does not undergo any meaningful review. And of course, this is dangerous to the reputation of the sciences and academia in general, because it allows irresponsible, unvetted work to get published. So the big red flag for this is if any journal promises you that they will publish your work, if you pay them, it's very likely to be a predatory journal. And big takeaway here, talk to a librarian. We can help you identify whether or not it's a predatory journal, and I'll show you some resources later that can also be used. Keep in mind that charging a fee alone is not necessarily an indicator of being a predatory journal. There's an increasing trend over the past 10 to 15 years for what we call open access journals. They distribute scholarly content at no cost to the reader, but in order to operate, that means they have to charge a fee to you, the author, to publish your work. So just because a journal charges a fee doesn't mean they're predatory. It does mean that they could be predatory, or they could be an open access journal. Look for other red flags, such as a promise of publication. There's a great website called Think, Check, Submit. I'm putting the link in chat as well. for you to consider that talks through some of the other measures to keep in mind when reviewing a journal to identify whether or not it's predatory. It literally has checklists in multiple languages for you to run down to self-verify whether or not a journal is predatory or not. So wrapping up with rigor, peer review is more rigorous than editorial review. If there's a fee alone, it may not be predatory, but if there's a fee and no review, it's probably a predatory journal. If you have any questions, ask a librarian. That's what we're here for. So outside of how rigorous a journal is, you also want to consider the fit. How
Tammy,
good, please.
So sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
before we go forward, I did get a quick message. Just wondering, are predatory journals reported somewhere? Is there like a list where we can find that information? Is that something you're getting to and I can just wait patiently?
Whoever you are reading my mind.
Okay.
Later in this webinar, we're actually going to show you a tool called Cabels that is going to include that. I just wanted to only show it at one point.
That's
I
fair.
will say that there are multiple lists out there. They are incomplete because there are always new scams popping up all the time. So just because a journal is not on a list, unfortunately, you still have to do due diligence, but the list can
Yes.
help.
Thank you so much, Tammy. And then we'll patiently wait for a little bit more of those resources to be unveiled. Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome. So when we're looking at journal fit, keep in mind that there are three different aspects I want you to keep in mind with measuring fit. And then I'm going to show you some tools to identify that. First, manuscript format. So there are many types of scholarly articles that you can publish. We tend to think of empirical research articles, traditional research studies when we think of scholarly articles. But you can also publish literature reviews, case studies, conceptual papers. There are many formats that your scholarly work can take. Now, these formats do vary a lot based on different journals. Different journals will offer different types of, say, particularly argumentative and stance-based papers. So be sure to look carefully at the journal and see if they offer a format that fits with your work. I also want you to consider your timeline. Look at the journal and how often and quickly do they publish? What is their acceptance rate? And then measure that against your own personal scholarly timeline for publication. If, say, you're interviewing for jobs, you may want to get published within a certain time frame if you're going up for tenure. I mention acceptance rate here simply because if they have a low acceptance rate, it increases your odds you might be rejected and have to resubmit, which takes a while. So that's why acceptance rate is listed here along with other timeline considerations. Finally, I want you to consider your research topic, the scope of your research, the scope of the journal, and how closely they fit. The more closely your work aligns with the work that the journal frequently publishes, increases the odds of your acceptance. So the first mechanism for identifying whether or not a journal is a good fit for your manuscript, I recommend finding journals organically while you're doing your literature review work. Is when you're researching in our library databases, note that the database should tell you what source, what journal the article was published in. And particularly if you see the same publication over and over again, that means there's a close alignment between the work you're researching and the work published by that journal. Usually in our library databases, if you click on that source title, the journal title, you'll be taken to more information about the journal where you can verify the subjects, whether it's peer-reviewed, what frequency it's published under, and a link to their website where you can explore more. I also want to point out a fantastic particular library database called Cabils. Or actually, Dan, I'm going to ask you to unmute now and correct my pronunciation.
Cabals.
Cabals, Cabals. I swear, everyone, he told me that 20 times. Cabals, and I couldn't get it. Thank you. So Cabals, I'm putting that link into the library chat. You're going to access it by going to our library A to Z databases. So you can see over our helpful library chat popped up. If you have any trouble finding Cabals, just go to the library chat. I love this database. I love this database so much because it allows you to find so much information about a journal in one place. So, for example, you can browse by a particular field. Say, if you're interested in publishing in educational technology and library science, and you're not familiar with the journals in that field, you could just click and get a list of journals. As you can see, they show 533 journals you can explore. You can also search if you have a particular publication. Let's say, because I'm a librarian, I want to publish in library and information science research. I search for that. Boom, there it is. And I can simply click on it I can see some topical information like what discipline and topics they include, which you may also have identified through your research as we talked about. To me, a lot of the money is under here where it says submissions. You can find out here what length the submissions typically are, what the acceptance rate is, the time to publication, so you can see if that aligns with your timeline, etc., etc. There's also a lot of information you can get on this page called Bibliometrics that my colleague Dan is going to talk about next under Prestige. The third way, outside of finding journals organically to get that fit, exploring Cabals, is I want you to also consider using the journal websites, which conveniently is available right in this platform that you can click on portal submission, for example, here, and go to their website. You can also find it via Google. Explore the content on the journal website. They typically will have something saying submit a manuscript, information for authors, instructions for authors, with information about what types of articles they submit. Very valuable information. A last thing I want to mention before we leave FIT is that wonderful question earlier we had about predatory journals and list. This database will also allow you to check that. You can either search for the journal, a journal title to see if it's been flagged by this database as predatory, or there actually is a tag here where predatory journals have been cataloged, and you can see a list here. Additionally, I appreciate they include detailed information about the violations so you can see specifically why a journal was flagged. Again, not all journals are indexed in this database and certainly not all predatory journals, but it's worth a check. All right, and with that, see last slide, I already said explore the websites. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dan to talk a little bit about journal prestige.
Thank you so much, Tam. I am going to talk to you about journal prestige, specifically in the form of bibliometrics. So Tam, if you could go to the next slide, this is something that you may have heard of, but you've probably seen as you're doing research and you're encountering scholarly information. And generally, bibliometrics are just an attempt to quantify or put a direct numerical value to the importance or prestige or ultimately value of a scholarly journal or any other particular kind of publication. And in the couple of decades since bibliometrics have really come onto the scene in scholarly communications, there have been many different kind of metrics, and they kind of compete with each other to best establish which is our best gauge or measurement to see which journals or which articles are having the most particular impact. So there's lots of different inputs that one can use to establish a bibliometric, and there's lots of different algorithms that tell us different things about how impactful a particular journal has actually been. This sounds great because we all want to know in a ranked system how or less important a particular publication is, but this system is not perfect. And so while I'm telling you about it today, I hope that you'll take this with a healthy glass of skepticism because bibliometrics often elide the actual importance or value of a particular publication. And ultimately, they reflect a value system where information is money. Remember, scholarly journals are absurdly expensive. And meritocracy is ultimately foundational to the way that we approach scholarly communication. So I'm skeptical of bibliometrics, but it's an important thing that you cannot ignore as you enter into the world of scholarly publishing. Next slide, please, Tam. There are a couple of ways that you can establish the bibliometrics for a particular journal, and ultimately these are mostly compiled by databases themselves, and they give you these kind of scores or numerical values that tell you how or less important a particular journal is. So as you are thinking about where do I want to publish, this certainly could be something that informs your choice and helps you decide where the best fit would be based on the prestige of that journal. These are the most important ones or the most that we are looking at. So in the top left, we see Schemago. They use this SJR, which is a ranking system based on how many times something in that journal has been cited, and indeed how important the citations are for that journal. So obviously, a higher cited journal and higher prestigious other articles are going to lead to a higher SJR, and therefore a more important or more impactful journal that it's publishing in. The JCI, or the Journal Citation Indicators, published by Web of Science, that's also something that we have access to at the National University Library. And as you're looking through it, you'll see these JCI scores through all of the journals. One is essentially the baseline score. So in this one, for something to have an 11.32 or a 10.86 score, that means it's an extremely important journal, one that any scholar could not really ignore. And ultimately, this is compiled nicely in that bottom left Google Scholar window that you're seeing, where it's the top 5 publications that are ranked by the H5 index, yet another ranking system that also takes into account how prestigious citations are and how many citations a publication garnered. Now, you will see that in these top 5 publications, Nature, the New England Journal of Medicine, Science, IEEE, and the Lancet, these are all hard sciences. They mostly value medicinal research. And ultimately, you're never going to see a philosophy journal or a social sciences journal or really any humanities journal. And so this is where that skepticism about bibliometrics needs to come into play, where you have to be an informed and knowledgeable user of these metrics to make sense of the system. Medicinal research is always going to be higher valued because more people are doing it at an international scale, and therefore there are going to be more citations giving a higher quantifiable score. And so these journals will always dominate. That doesn't mean, though, that if you have a low scored journal, it's a bad choice. Often what that means is, like bibliometrics often forgets, niche work is incredibly important. Work that doesn't get a ton of traction in a traditional sense can be very important, but that doesn't mean it's bad. There are other ways of assessing or sussing out the impact that you can use. And so I'd like to bring your attention to that bottom right window that has the 207 and the colorful wheel. This is a lot of scholars' answer to traditional bibliometrics that value journals like Nature way more than they value journals that have a more niche audience. These are called alt metrics, and what they do is they try to quantify in other ways than just traditional bibliometrics how impactful something has been. So we can already see alt metrics take into account how many blogs or Wikipedia entries or tweets, I'm not going to call them X's, or Facebook posts. Really, an alt metric can be any kind of way of saying people are seeing this, they're being impacted by it, and overall, this is an important contribution to scholarly knowledge. And we're going to come back to alt metrics in just a moment when we talk about how you can use this to your own advantage. So next slide, Tammy. So the wrap up is that metrics are really accurate and really important, especially for hard sciences. But if you are publishing in the social sciences or humanities, you need to take a skeptical eye to that. Niche work also is really underrepresented. That doesn't make it bad. There are very few researchers exploring English language learning tendencies in rural South American schools. That doesn't mean that the work isn't important, but it's never going to have a high bibliometric score. Citation counts are not the most important thing, and you need to have other ways of sussing out the quality of a journal. Many of them are based on the information that my colleague Tammy has gotten to you already. So don't compare apples to oranges. Don't hold yourself in esteem next to a journal like IEEE or Nature. You have to consider those other qualitative aspects like fit and rigor and how well this is suited for your own publication needs. So I'll pass it back to you, Tam.
Thank you so much for all that valuable insight. And I hope that all this gives you some ideas on what you can do to make the best and most mindful selection about what journals you want to consider publishing in. So I want to give some advice here about navigating the submission and revision process here. My perspective is that I've been very fortunate in my career to publish several scholarly peer-reviewed articles. I have peer-reviewed several articles, many articles actually, and I have gotten the opportunity to serve as an editor for 2 different peer-reviewed journals. So I have a lot of perspective from all the different perspectives of the process. So I wanted to share some tips from about what journal editors really want from what I would say a great author. What would make you a great author? First and foremost, I would say great authors take feedback. Inherently, you are going to get some feedback, whether you go through an editorial review process or the more rigorous peer review. It is very rare for a journal article to be submitted as is with no revisions whatsoever. Revisions are the norm. That being said, let me tell you, oh boy, can it hurt when you get that manuscript that you sweated and cried and maybe bled over, and you get it back covered in metaphorical red ink with revisions. Note that the more feedback you get, that actually is a sign of praise, because if your manuscript was dead awful, the reviewers would have just told the editor, don't publish this. They wouldn't have taken the time to give you as much constructive feedback. When you get over the inherent crush of getting revision feedback, crawl out from under your desk. If you're like me, put aside the chocolate ice cream that you're eating out of depression, take the suggestions and make the revisions. As a former editor, I cannot tell you how many authors received peer review feedback and then never submitted a revised manuscript. Possibilities, maybe they got offended that they were given feedback for revisions. But as I said, that's the norm. Some of them, I truly believe, didn't make the revisions because they maybe thought that the revisions would take too long. Let me tell you, being on both sides of it, revisions generally do not take as long as you think they would. You can really just sit down with a cup of coffee and knock those suckers out. So please, when you get the suggestions, keep moving forward. And I'm going to pause to really shout out the message in chat about the Advanced Research Center, which we're going to share their link on the final slide here, but they are a fantastic resource in your corner as you work through the submission and revision process. I also want to, as a counterpoint to taking the revisions, I want to encourage you to keep in mind that great authors disagree if needed. There may be times when you are given what looks to be incorrect, factually incorrect, crazy feedback. Ask about it. Reviewers are human. Sometimes they make a mistake. Sometimes 2 peer reviewers will contradict each other. The editor's job is to help you navigate that process. There is never a problem with polite dialogue, respectful communication, and questioning. Even if, and I would say actually particularly if, say the reviewers ask you to do something that you feel is an ethical quandary or defeats the purpose of your work. It is always okay to politely push back and engage in a dialogue. As it said in chat, iterative process, iterative. And furthering the iterative process, great authors are going to resubmit if needed, whether they reject your manuscript or for some reason, you may withdraw your manuscript. Power goes both ways. Maybe you're researching orangutans and they tell you they want you to switch it to chimpanzees. Unfair ask. You reject them and you withdraw your manuscript. Submit at a different journal. Remember, rejection is very common. My general advice is to submit to the most prestigious journals under consideration first, simply because that way, if they reject you, you can roll to another journal that you have in mind. Though, counter that, as I said before, with your internal timeline and what goals you want to reach when. Do keep in mind that when you resubmit, you need to revise. Every journal is going to have its own layout, its own editorial processes, its own citation management or citation tools. So do revise your manuscript. You can find all that information about how your manuscript needs to be formatted at the journal's website. Remember, there are multiple ways of finding that. I also would be neglectful if I didn't mention now that when it comes to updating the citations in particular, that's where using a citation management tool can be very helpful and automate some of that process. The library offers workshops on RefWorks and Zotero if you're interested in learning more about citation management tools. Finally, I just want to end by reminding you that journal editors are spinning a lot of plates in the air. They have a lot of obligations, but first and foremost, I would say they do have an obligation to you, the author, the people who are submitting works. You can't publish a journal without authors writing. So again, that polite dialogue, that conversation, that's always reasonable. There, as an editor, we are here to support you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to talk a little bit about weighing and evaluating the impact of your work post-publication.
Indeed, and if you thought the iterative process was over when you published, boy, have I news for you. When you go through this process of becoming published, that can represent significant milestones in your career. It can lead to promotion, can lead to higher pay. If you're in academics, it might lead to tenure. And so you need to be very careful about how you're managing and sussing out how you've done in this post-publication. And again, we're back to this bibliometrics discussion where we're going to learn a little bit about it, but also do so with a healthy dose of skepticism. So the H-index, just like it was used to discern how important a particular journal was, can also be used to discern at the article level how impactful an article is. And an H-index is simply a combination of quantity, and that's number of papers, and citations and quality, and that gives you a sense of either how important an author was or how important a particular paper was. So it can be used for really any kind of scope in the scholarly publishing world. The H-index is the most notable and the most historically important bibliometric, but there are a lot of answers to it because a lot of scholars said, well, sometimes there's a lot of papers, but they don't get a lot of traction, or sometimes one paper gets a lot of traction, but there ultimately weren't that many. And so there's a few other algorithms that help also articulate bibliometric impact. Google Scholar has its own set of bibliometrics. The G-index is a direct response to the H-index, and that way is higher citation count. So if an author or a publication has a whole bunch of citations, then that G-index is going to be a reflective higher than its H-index counterpart would be. And then the I-10, which is also embedded in Google Scholar, just counts papers with 10 or more citations. So again, it's really privileging those papers that have many citations compared to the H-index that would take into account all of the papers. In addition to that, Google Scholar maybe has the most clear-cut and focused way that you can assess bibliometric impact at the article level, which is just their cited by count. You see this as you're navigating Google Scholar, and bigger numbers equals more important, lower numbers equals less impact. And we can see in this Bandura article, his most famous one, it's been cited more than 115,000 times. Obviously, that's a very splashy and noteworthy article that was published, and you can see it right there in the cited by count. That cited by count also manages how sources are listed in Google Scholar, where higher cited by counts generally elevate those sources, among other things, to the top of the Google Scholar navigation pane. In addition to that, PLOS, or the Public Library of Science, which is a free database, also tries to take into account a number of other ways of quantifying bibliometric impact. So if you're navigating that database, you can see that in addition just to the clicks, there's also citation counts, views, and shares, which leads us seamlessly back to our wonderful alt metrics. We recognize this icon from before when we were talking about it at a journal level, but you can use this in a very important way at the article level, especially if you're one of those folks who's doing great work in a niche subject and you may not have the backing of really important bibliometrics. Alt metrics ultimately are reflected here by news outlets and blogs and so on, as we can see on the screen, but they're not limited to that. Alt metrics can be anything. Let's say you published an article and it's in a national university class and tens of thousands of students have seen it or interacted with it. That is an alt metrics, and that's something that you can take to an employer or to who hired you, or just to your own sense of self-satisfaction that you earned and say, this is the impact that my paper has had. I hope that you'll be creative and understanding there's a lot of ways that scholarly communication can be impactful to very important audiences. Next slide, please, Tam.
So I'm actually going to jump in here on this slide because I am throwing myself to the wolves here with a personal example I wanted to give on why you can't take citation count alone as a measure of, say, evaluating an article. So what I have here is at the top of my Google Scholar page, you can see here, I've written an article that was cited 83 times, which is very good for my field. However, which you might think, wow, this article's got to be fantastic. Really, though, if you dive into those 83 citations and start to parse out the actual scholarly conversation happening, you'll see that most of those citations are actually gently critical, because the approach that I and my co-authors took was one about transition shock for transfer students. And several people rightfully pointed out that that was a deficit-based approach to considering transfer student needs. And in the scholarly conversation, there's been a call to maybe look at more of a strengths-based approach. Why do I mention this? I just mention this because numbers alone can be deceiving. I wanted to back up what Dan was saying. It's not that these authors are saying Tammy's article sucks, though they might have been. I'm actually still very proud of this article. I'm even very proud of the fact that it brought a lot of people out of the woodwork who clearly felt very passionate about strengths-based, positive-oriented approaches to evaluating needs and gave them a voice. But citation counts alone can be deceiving. Make sure to actually look at the scholarly conversation happening.
Thanks, Tammy. And ultimately, I had to talk about bibliometrics because in today's scholarly communications world, you cannot deny their importance and the value that many scholars hold them in. But we have to approach this with a nuance and knowledgeable consumption so that we can all be active and useful participants in the scholarly communication marketplace. And just like if you're having a conversation, metrics might attempt to gauge the impact. Some people might talk more in a conversation and some less. Some might have different perspectives and biases. Sometimes that might get more edged out of the conversation. That doesn't mean that they're inherently better. And in the same way, impact cannot always be quantified. So it's just one part of your publishing toolbox that I hope that you'll take into account all of the different and diverse considerations when you're using that to leverage your own work or deciding where to publish. And of course, many of you are scholars who are working on or recently completed your own dissertation. So we hope that you'll use all of the hard work and the sweat equity that you have put into that to actually get another measurable, confident achievement out of that. So we're going to talk a little bit just now about publishing your dissertation and the special considerations that you might make to upcycling the work that you've done into a scholarly publication.
So,
And the first question that we might have is, are you able to do that? And absolutely, you are able to do that. And you get to publish what you've already said. So you have a kind of get out of jail card when it comes to the self-pleasure publishing of your own work.
Absolutely. So even though your dissertation has been published in ProQuest Dissertations and Theses, or will be, In this case, you still own the copyright, so you can decide how it can be reworked. And I just do want to emphasize that in general, verbatim self-plagiarizing, republishing the same article or the same time is frowned on in academia and may actually be a violation of copyright in terms of service that you agree with your publishers. But the dissertation is like your wonderful opportunity where you're allowed to do that. And that really can help you build your scholarly agenda, your research agenda, which is outside the scope of what we are talking about here today. But please talk to the GSSC and the Advanced Resource Center about the idea of planning your scholarly agenda for even just a few years out. How much you want to publish, what publication venues look best when aligned with your career goals, and how you might be able to use your dissertation as building blocks for laying out that research agenda. I do want to emphasize we said building blocks. The dissertation is a very special, unique scholarly format following its own particular conventions and expectations. It's rarely suitable for publication elsewhere exactly as it is written and formatted, but it provides a wealth of material for upcycling, is a term I really like to use for this process because it implies conversion and evolution from one thing to another. One option you have with your dissertation is to take a look at it in its entirety and perhaps revise it into a book. Many people do this. Keep in mind, again, the layout and arrangement of a dissertation is not a perfect alignment with a typical book manuscript. You will still need to condense and revise sections of it, consider the audience, and revise as a need for that. The second option you have for your dissertation is to draw from it. Excerpt from your dissertation to create multiple scholarly publications, book chapters, empirical research articles, other types of articles like case studies or literature reviews, theoretical perspectives, non-scholarly articles for publications like newsletters, trade journals, reputable blogs in your field, conference presentations, including poster presentations. The Graduate Studies Support Center, thank you very much for putting in the definition there, offers annually a doctoral dissertation poster session. So the same dissertation can, say, become a poster presentation about the research, maybe a conference presentation on how that research was applied, then maybe a theoretical article about your perspective, a published literature review on your field, and then finally an empirical research article, possibly all from the same dissertation. Keep in mind that you may have to condense or expand parts again. Best advice I can give you on this, because oftentimes students follow up with, well, how exactly do I do that? Look at examples. The best thing you can do is read the types of work or review the types of work that you want to create. Go to conference presentations, watch the recordings, look at conference posters, read blog articles, read empirical research articles. That way you know what models you want to imitate. Imitate, imitate, imitate. Fake it till you make it, perhaps, is another way of looking at it. I prefer to go imitate people who know what they're doing. The last advice we have for you here is to build from it. In addition to just straight up slicing and dicing it sushi style and making a bunch of different sushi rolls, use it as a true, not just building block, but as a foundation. Apply and adapt parts of your dissertation research. Find new uses for your research, new audiences. Consider maybe cross-discipline collaboration with someone in a different field, new angles to approach, practical real-world applications of your work. Take your theoretical study, spiral it into an applied case study. That's boom, another publication from the same core. This is the heart of building a research agenda. When people say, I've published 5 peer-reviewed articles, often they're not totally new topics. You'll see a common theme, a thread throughout them. One last note before we move on to questions at the end of this or this presentation, do keep in mind that if you reused copyrighted material like images or test instruments in your dissertation, the rights and privileges you got to do that may or may not cover reproducing that in a different form, like in a scholarly journal or in a book. So please make sure you have permission to do that. Contact the copyright holder, as you already did, to get permission for your dissertation as necessary. All right, I know this has been a wild 45 minutes. You guys just got a lot at you. So here are some resources for more assistance. Dan and I have our contact information up there. Please hit us with your questions.
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions. One that came in the Q&A. I'll go ahead and start with that one. And then Dan, if you see something else that came up. I just want to start with the blanket statement. Thank you so much, Tammy and Dan, for coming and sharing this information with us. And I also want to make sure that all of our audience members know that we are going to provide the recorded copy to all of the registrants. We did get that question just a few different times in the chat, so I just want to make sure it's clear. But the very first question I'm going to start off with is one that was in the Q&A, and it's two-part, so I'm going to start with the first part. New scholars often face barriers with publishing their very first research article. So are there any thoughts on using high acceptance, in parentheses, easy, author paid referee journal to get your foot in the door?
That's a good question, and it's tempting, and ultimately people do it. People use a lot of tactics to kind of game the system and to do things that are maybe not to the high standard of quality. I think as scholars, though, you should be examining the components of fit and rigor and prestige to make sure that your publishing legacy ultimately will be of high of caliber as you can ultimately manage it to be. So while some people do that kind of thing or take that into consideration, I think that you should understand your own position, even as a new scholar, as one that you should really shoot high and make sure that you're looking at the best quality journals, because ultimately you can't take it back. Once you get published, that will be there forever and your legacy will reflect that. And so I think I would urge you to aim as high as you possibly can to make sure that the journal not only is as prestigious as you think that you can manage, but also as perfect of a fit as you can manage. And I think that'll be a lot more important in the long run than just trying to get your name out there.
And I want to follow up with two additional thoughts that came to mind, Dan, as you were weighing in on that incredibly articulate answer. Is my feeling is there are many other tricks and hacks you can use as well, such as forming a reading group with maybe some colleagues, swapping manuscripts, reading, collaborating, getting co-authors to help. And again, the Advanced Resource Center, the Graduate Studies Support Center can help you learn some of those maybe scholarly healthy hacks and tricks outside of. I will also say I have mixed feelings about even the movement for ethical, open access, non-predatory paid publication for new scholars, because new scholars do often correlate with, say, financial insecurity. And I feel like asking sometimes someone who is new early in their career to front money to publish is a lot, and that perhaps the burden of open access should fall on more established scholars. The only thing I will say about that is, as you're accepting jobs, keep in mind many institutions now will pay your publication fee if you publish in an ethical open access journal. So that's just something I want to say is, don't feel like there is this burden that you have to publish open access if you simply cannot at this point in your career. But Emily, other questions?
Yeah, no, that was great. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time to answer that one. And I know that part of that is your recommendations, but another part of that is obviously also, I mean, you did leave it open, it is up to the person, but I appreciate the high standard expectations and recommendations. Prestigious journals can take up to a year to make a decision. Can a person only submit to one journal at a time. If they go through the cycle of submit and reject, it could be possible that maybe even that research might be considered dated. What are your thoughts on that? We'll start with Tammy, and then Dan, if you have anything to follow up.
I'm nodding because somehow I dropped that off of my script and didn't mention that, and which is absurd because you are limited to submitting to one scholarly publication at a time, which is why it's like committing to dating somebody. You have to kind of be mindful about who you commit to date, who you decide to submit to. I will point out two things, though, to keep in mind is that for better or for worse in academia, that is a known feature. So yes, eventually your research will get dated, but it takes a while. People recognize, oh, this has been in work for a while. You can also withdraw your manuscript. If you feel like the process is getting abusive, I give you permission to withdraw your manuscript from consideration and submit it somewhere else. That is power you have if you want to make that choice. Dan, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think that absolutely covers it. And ultimately, one thing you can also do is you can look in journals and read a whole bunch of articles in those particular journals and see approximately when are people citing references, what kind of references those are. You quickly get a feel for the expectations and considerations of the journal. And so that could be another dimension as you're thinking about the very long-term commitment to publishing within a particular publication.
And thank you so much. Yes, I think I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. Any other final thoughts? I did want to share one final thought actually from my what I captured from some of your presentation today. Well, there was many things, but one thing that I'm seeing as a option for publication. One thing that really struck me was the build from it. Build from your research that you've already been doing as doctoral students at NU, or maybe if you're not in your dissertation, maybe you're in your master's program and you're interested in a particular subject, building from these projects that you've already been kind of pouring your heart and soul into. And a part of that is networking. Being able to network with other people in your field that have similar interests, similar research interests. And from there, you can grow as a researcher in your field as well. And so what I would say is don't be afraid to reach out and see if there is a possible collaboration or connection. Maybe it won't work for the particular person that you're trying to reach out to. Maybe they already have too much on their plate, but we don't know until we ask. That type of networking can be fruitful for future publications and just making connections in the scholarly field. And so I just wanted to speak to that really briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tammy and Dan and see if there's any other final thoughts that you'd like to share, and then I'll close this out.
Absolutely, Emily. And just in the interest of having a collaborative force with you, the library resources are right there. It was already asked in chat. We do work with alums all the time. So in addition to having a lot of scholarly information access as an alumni of National University, you also have access to our amazing library team. So we definitely hope to hear from you.
And I want to give a shout out. I'm putting into chat. The Advanced Research Center is offering quarterly mixers with the specific intent of trying to arrange these kind of synchronous collaboration opportunities where you can find people who are working in your field. So please check those out. And when in doubt, use your network, even if it's just everyone here at National University who wants you to succeed. We're all here to work with you.
Thank you so much, Tammy and Dan. And in the interest of time, we are ending on time. And until the next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.